Tonight, though. Tonight we're talking about the Bible. As you know, the Bible is a very important part of our Christian belief system. We as Christians consider the Bible to be the very Word of God. And so we look at the Bible to understand what God is like and how we should live our lives. As you also probably know, the Bible is a collection of 66 books that were written over a period of 1,500 years. But this raises several questions about our belief system concerning the Bible. For example, how is it decided that the Bible should include these particular 66 books? Who made this decision? In other words, what books should really be in the Bible? How did that decision get made, and who made that decision? Well, remember what we as Christians are claiming that the Bible is. We're claiming that the Bible is simply a collection of messages from God. Therefore, it's pretty simple. If something is a message from God, then it belongs in the Bible. If it's not a message from God, it doesn't belong in the Bible. So really the better question here is, how do we know what messages are really from God? And that's why we've already covered that topic. I was here, I guess last month even. Yeah, we're in November now. Last month I was here and we talked about that issue. How do we know if a message is really from God? I think the best way to know is something that I refer to as the miracle test. As we've discussed, it's similar to in ancient times how a king would often use some sort of seal to authenticate that a message really was from the king. We've discussed that this seal had to have certain features in order to perform this function. The seal had to be unique, it had to be easily recognizable, and it had to be something that only the king could do. Miracles perform a very similar function. They help us recognize that a message really is from God because, again, they are unique, they're easily recognizable, and miracles are something that only God can do or give somebody the ability to do. So miracles perform that same function. They help prove that a message really is from God. Now, sometimes people think that there are lots and lots and lots of miracles that occurred during biblical times. But that's actually incorrect. As I mentioned, the Bible was written over a period of 1,500 years, and it records approximately 250 miracles. So you engineers in the room, you math whizzes, can do the math and see that averages out to be one miracle every 6 years, which really isn't all that many if you think about it. In actuality, the miracles didn't happen on a regular basis like that, though, every 6 years. That's just calculating the average. What actually happened is there were 3 very specific short time periods in which there were tons and tons and tons of miracles, and then spans of 100 years, several hundred years sometimes would go by, and there wouldn't be any miracles. So really there was only 3 main periods in biblical times where there were miracles taking place. Let's think for a moment just about what was going on during those 3 short periods. The 3 short periods that I'm talking about, the first one is during the time of Moses. So if you're familiar with the Bible stories, this would be when Moses was doing a lot of miracles, the plagues in Egypt, for example, let my people go, his message to Pharaoh, all the plagues and such. There were a lot of miracles during that time, right? Parting of the Red Sea, one of the most classic ones, of course. The other time, short period of time where there were a lot of miracles taking place was during the time of the prophets. So you think of the time of Elijah and Elisha and all of those miracles. And then the third time, of course, is the first century, the time of Jesus and the apostles. There were lots of miracles, all the stories that we have in the Gospels, for example, of Jesus' miracles, and then his disciples, the apostles, doing miracles throughout the New Testament in the first century. So you might think, well, why were so many miracles taking place during those three time periods? Well, that was when God was giving new messages to humanity. Moses, the time of Moses, is when the first part of the Bible was written. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, what we call the Pentateuch, right? So God was giving revelation, and the miracles were there to authenticate that those messages really were from God. You can see that all explained in Exodus 4. During the time of the prophets, Elijah, Elisha, other prophets, there were a lot of miracles taking place, again, because God was giving new revelation, new messages to humanity. The second part, or the latter part, of what we refer to as the Old Testament. And then, of course, the New Testament, we understand to be messages from God, and those messages, the New Testament books, needed authentication, needed authenticating via miracles, and so that's why we see all those miracles from Jesus and the apostles. So in that sense, the last time period then, where there were a bunch of miracles taking place, was the first century. And I would say then, miracles, at least those grandiose type miracles that authenticate God's messages, have stopped since the first century. That's why we don't see those type of miracles today. We're not saying that God can't do those type of miracles today. Obviously, he still can or could if he wanted to. But because he's not giving us new messages, there is no reason for those type of grandiose miracles. Tonight, what we're going to do is focus merely on the New Testament. So we're going to focus on the question, why these particular 27 books? How was that decision made that these 27 books should make up the New Testament? If you're familiar with my teaching style, what I'm not going to do is just dump a bunch of facts on you. This, especially when we're discussing history and the past and trying to dig through historical evidence, as you probably know if you've taken history classes, the raw data can feel very overwhelming sometimes. Names and dates and terms and jargon. And so my goal tonight isn't just to give you a bunch of data, facts. My goal, and this is usually how I do things in my teaching style, is to give you an overall argument and kind of show you how the argument works, how the argument or the thinking process flows, so to speak. So then you know what facts are actually important. So if you understand how the thought process works, then as you learn the facts or record the facts or have books that remember the facts, because if you're like me, you have a terrible memory and you just have to look up the factoids later, you know why the facts are important and where they're important and which ones are pertinent. So I'm going to give you the overall thought process tonight and then back up some of the premises with some factual evidence. But my goal isn't just to dump a bunch of facts on you. First, though, before we really get into it, I want to start you off with the discussion question. So here's what I'd like you to discuss at your table for a few minutes, just to kind of get your thought process going. Maybe some of you have been exposed to this work already, or if not, it's a good way just to kind of start thinking about it yourself, and then we can dive into it in more detail. So here's the discussion question. How would you respond if you were in a conversation with somebody, Christian, non-Christian, doesn't matter, and they were asking you this question: why are these 27 books the particular ones in the New Testament? Why do they belong in the New Testament and not others? So go ahead, talk at your table about how you would address that question right now. Okay. What I'm about to walk you through now, I used to call an argument that these 27 books are messages from God. These 27 books of the New Testament are messages from God. But I think it's probably better described as a thought process, what I'm about ready to take you through. So just bear with me. It's kind of extended, but I think it's just the thought process behind why we have come to this conclusion that yes, these 27 books are in fact messages from God and therefore should be included in the New Testament. So it begins with, number one, God exists. Joel likes to make fun of this part of the argument. Thought process. But I include it because if you think about it, if there is no God, there can't be any messages from God, right? So it's almost just a reminder that, at least I think, the best way to build a case from ground zero that Christianity is true is to begin making the case that, in fact, there is a God, that God does exist. So I think that's the best place to start in apologetics or in building a case for Christianity from ground zero. So if God exists, if we've established that premise, if you will, that first step in the thought process, then we can move on to number two. And I think it's reasonable to conclude that if there is a God, that this God would want to communicate with us, right? Communicate to humanity through what we call prophets, right? Now, prophets might sound, might carry some connotations, but all really that we mean with the word prophet is somebody who has a message from God. So if and I don't misquote me walking out of the room tonight, I'm not claiming that I have a message from God, but if I did, it'd just be a simple thing that God has given me a message and I'm communicating it to you, and if I did that, then it would be appropriate to call me a prophet. That's all we mean by the term, is somebody who has received a message from God and is passing it on to others. If that's the case, 3 would follow from that, of course. If 2 is correct, then there are some people who really do have messages from God. And I believe that is the case. I think you can make a good case for that. Now, we also need to recognize that some people claim to have messages from God, but they don't. And this is why we need to be very careful. This is one of the reasons why we talk about the miracle test and other tests to know if somebody really has a message from God or not, because there are a lot of fakes out there. Not only fakes, but also just honest mistakes. People who think they have a message from God, but they really don't. How can we tell the difference? Well, I think one of the best ways we can tell the difference is the miracle test, as we've already discussed. Now, the miracle test is not foolproof, right? There are ways that the miracle test, like any way that we can develop human knowledge, can break down or be mistaken or fail, right? We might be tricked by, let's say, an illusionist who doesn't really do a miracle, but is so good as an illusionist, tricks us into thinking that they are doing miracles. So it's not airtight. The miracle test isn't foolproof, right? But nothing is when it comes to forming human beliefs, human knowledge. Even the scientific method can break down and mistakes can happen with that. So any form of knowledge is not perfect. We're never going to achieve that 100% certainty. The miracle test can be strengthened with other tests, though. So we've discussed already the moral test and other tests to know if something really is from God or not. But I think the miracle test is probably the strongest test that we have. Number 6, then, just walking through this thought process, is that there's good historical evidence that the apostles, Jesus' disciples, in the first century, claimed to have messages from God and then did miracles to authenticate those messages. And this is where a lot of the, factoids will come into play. This is where a lot of the historical work needs to be done, providing evidence for these things, giving people these evidence, looking into those historical facts. But at least as you understand the thought process, now you know why and why those facts are important and where they fit into the overall thought process. Number 7 would be then, another therefore, the New Testament should include books that the apostles said were messages from God. I think that's a reasonable conclusion. So, then number 8, as I've kind of discussed with 6 already, the pertinent thing to do here would be the historical research to figure out which books the apostles did in fact say were from God. Now, a lot of this research has been done, obviously. In fact, the early church councils did this sort of historical research, and they concluded, based on their research, these early church councils, they did this research and concluded that yes, it was these 27 books, they were the ones that the apostles said were messages from God. So that is the process of how we as Christians, I guess you could say, came to this conclusion that it was these 27 books that belong in the New Testament. Now you might say to yourself, and we're going to dig through these early church councils a little bit later this evening, but you might think to yourself, well, why should we trust those councils? Maybe you have some sort of distrust for those councils, and you might think, well, there was a conspiracy going on, or they had ulterior motives in why they chose these 27 books. So that, I could sympathize with that. And so if maybe that's you or describe somebody that you're talking to, you can say, okay, well, let's jettison then their research and their conclusions, and we can do that research ourselves. We can do that research ourselves, looking into the historical evidence from the first century to see what the apostles said and which books were actually affirmed by the apostles. So we can do that sort of research today, and people do. I'll give you some examples of this contemporary scholarly research. These are 2 books, and I'll just send them around. You can take a look at them. The first one here is and this is just going to go through all 27 books in the New Testament, just one book at a time, and give all of that historical evidence done by contemporary scholarship, providing that evidence that each of those 27 books was affirmed by the original apostles in the first century. So this first one is by D.A. Carson and Douglas Moo. Carson got his PhD, so he's a scholar. He got his PhD at the University of Cambridge. You can't get much higher, academic credentials than that. And Douglas Moo, unfortunate last name, but he got his PhD at the University of St. Andrews. And then this book, and again, this is just standard textbooks, but it's by scholars laying out all of the historical evidence for the New Testament books. This one, I had all of these authors as professors, and the one that I'll draw your attention to is Kostenberger, Andreas Kostenberger. He's a well-known scholar, particularly he focuses his work on the Gospel of John. Okay, but this is similar to this book in that it'll go through all 27, providing, if you want factoids, you've got hundreds and hundreds of pages of factoids. But this is why the factoids are pertinent and then how they fit in to the overall thought process. So I'll send those around. You can glance through them, take a look, take a picture, write down the titles if you want to purchase them yourself. So I think we can conclude then the way this thought process works is the conclusion that yes, it is these 27 books are in fact messages from God. So the New Testament, as we understand it then, is just supposed to be a collection of messages from God during the time of Jesus and the apostles. So that's how we came to this conclusion of these 27 books belong in the New Testament, in the Bible. That's the overall thought process, and now we're going to go through and look at a bit of the historical evidence as we have time. But again, this is what scholars do for a living, is dig into the actual historical evidence And this is a whole huge, exciting area of scholarly research and apologetics. So if this is the historical side of apologetics, really trips your trigger, this would be a great place to focus in on and become more familiar with this sort of evidence. But I want to give you another discussion question before we move on. So I'll go back to the thought process after you guys understand the question. But I want you to play devil's advocate. I think that's a healthy thing to do just for your own self, to think through this process and to envision maybe where an opponent would push back. So if you would push back on this argument, now you might agree with it, thought process, whatever you want to call it. You might agree with the conclusion, but play the devil's advocate and discuss for a while where you would press back, or what premise, what point in the thought process that you would push back on or disagree or challenge. If that makes sense, I'll go back to here so you can see the thought process and then discuss at your table where you would push back on it. So I'll give you a few minutes. Go ahead. Now, one important jargon word, if you will, is the word canon, right? So you might have heard that before when people talk about the New Testament canon. All they mean by that term is the collection of 27 books. So if you list out the 27 books, that is the canon. That's the New Testament canon, those 27 books. So if I use that term in the next half an hour or so as we wrap this up, that's all I mean is the list of those 27 books, the New Testament canon. Now, some people claim, you might have heard this even in classes or just generally, in our culture, you might have heard that this canon then, the New Testament canon, was determined centuries later, many centuries after Jesus and the apostles, and it was determined by politically motivated meetings, specifically the Council of Nicaea, 325, and the Council of Hippo, 393. You might have heard that that was how the New Testament was determined, that those particular folks at those councils made this decision, and these were more politically motivated meetings. But that is a gross misunderstanding of the actual process, what actually happened in how we have come to have the New Testament as it is today. It's a gross misunderstanding because from the very beginning of the Christian movement, it was understood that only the books which were affirmed by the apostles as messages from God should be in the New Testament. Sometimes this is referred, you might have heard this piece of jargon, this term before, apostolic authority. Big term, apostolic authority, but all that's being tried to be communicated with that term is that the apostles not even necessarily had the authority, but more had the knowledge or had the understanding of what messages were from God and which ones weren't, because they were the ones who got the messages from God. Does that make sense? I mean, of all people, they should know which messages were really from God because they were the ones who received those messages, right? And that was the understanding from the very beginning of the Christian movement, that it was the apostles that we looked to know what messages were really from God and which ones weren't. I keep using the word affirmed. You might have been confused by that or noticed that I was using that term affirmed by the apostles, not authored by the apostles. Because as you know, not all of the 27 books in the New Testament were authored by apostles. Some of them were written by people who weren't apostles, for example, Luke. But using that example, Luke recorded what Jesus and the apostles did and said and taught. So think of the Gospel of Luke and then the book of Acts. Luke, not being an apostle, not being a prophet himself, recorded what the prophets did, said, and taught. And then the apostles, i.e. prophets, I'm using those two terms interchangeably, they affirmed that what Luke had recorded was in fact accurate. Does that make sense? So it's not as though the apostles authored all of the New Testament. It's that they affirmed all of the books of the New Testament as being accurate and really, truly messages from God. So ultimately, we look to the apostles to know what's from God and thus what should be in the New Testament. I'll give you a little bit of historical evidence that we have that the very early Christians understood things this way. In other words, they understood this apostolic authority that I've been describing tonight. They understood from the very beginning of the Christian movement that only the books that the apostles affirmed should be accepted as true messages from God. Well, why? Well, it's because they were the ones who were able to perform miracles. They used the miracle test, just as we've been developing here and explaining at Ratio Christi. So these miracles by the apostles confirmed that they truly did have messages from God. That's why we see, for example, in the New Testament in several places, I'll just give you one verse here tonight, that to be an apostle, you had to be able to perform miracles. In fact, that was the distinguishing mark of being an apostle, a true prophet. So here's a verse. This goes way back into the first century, of course. This is from one of Paul's letters, which we know from historical evidence. Most everybody agrees that 2 Corinthians is one of those books that just has so much evidence for it that it was early and it was in fact written by Paul that's hardly contested by anybody, even non-Christian scholars. So 2 Corinthians 12:12 says, "The distinguishing marks of a true apostle were performed among you with all perseverance." What are these distinguishing marks? Signs, wonders, and miracles. Because again, those things confirmed they were true prophets and really did have messages from God. So if this is the case, if it's all about the apostles, if it's all about what they said, this apostolic authority, if that's what it's all about, then what is the deal with these councils? Why does everybody talk about these councils that took place in the 4th century? The Council of Nicaea and the Council of Hippo. What were these councils all about then? What were they even for in light of this apostolic authority? Well, by the time you get to the 4th century, by the time that they had this first council, the Council of Nicaea in 325, by the time you get to that point in history, there were several people who had written books and claimed that they had been written by a famous apostle. And you can see why this would have happened, right? If somebody had, let's say, new ideas that they wanted Christians to accept, or if you were trying to be an influential leader, or if you were trying to convince people you really had a message from God, but you were a nobody, right? Why would anybody listen to you? Well, if you said that this message was really written by, let's say, the Apostle Peter, well, then you're going to get people's attention. Because that even assumes the idea of apostolic authority, right? The people that were lying about this understood apostolic authority, and that's why they lied about it and claimed that their books, which were really their ideas, were actually written by a famous apostle, because they were trying to hook in to that apostolic authority that the Christians understood how things worked. So what the councils had to do, by the time we get to the 4th century then, the councils were trying to verify which of the books that were floating around really in fact were affirmed by the apostles. They understood these councils, and you can see, we even have notes from people, who went to these councils and these meetings, and the notes that they took and the official documents that they put together. We can research all that. And it's very clear that's what they were doing. They were trying to verify which books were in fact affirmed by the apostles and which ones were just fakes. So these councils were doing historical research very similar to the type of historical research that we can do today, and in fact scholars do today. One of the advantages, though, that the councils had is that they were closer in time to the time of the apostles. So in that sense, it might have been, could have been, probably was a bit easier for them to do that historical research. I say maybe, possibly, because nowadays we have so much technology, and there's so much more research that we have at our fingertips that we can do, and traveling and communication has advanced to such a degree. I almost wonder if we've gotten to the point now where we can even do better research. Even though we're longer away from the apostles, maybe we can do better scholarly research than they could in the 4th century because we have access to all this additional stuff. I'm not sure if that's the case, but potentially. Either way, I think it's good to understand what the councils did in their research and to look at current contemporary research as well. I think it's important to do both. Well, you might ask, well, why didn't they have these councils earlier then? If that's what these councils were doing, if they were just doing historical research to see what the apostles affirmed and didn't affirm from the 1st century, why didn't they have these councils earlier? Why did they wait so long? I mean, 325, we're talking almost 200 years? Why didn't they have these councils earlier? Why didn't they do this research in the 2nd century, let's say? Why did they wait till the 4th? Well, remember, one of the main reasons they didn't do this research earlier, get together and have these huge, these were international councils. People would travel from all across the known world at the time to have these big meetings and councils. It was quite the ordeal, especially before modern transportation, of course. But one of the reasons they didn't have them earlier is that Christianity was illegal until 313. So imagine, right, having a huge international conference to bring all the leaders of a movement together and do research and compare research when what you're actually talking about is illegal to do. That would make it very difficult. Another reason why these councils didn't come till a bit later is because there was pretty standard agreement as to what books were affirmed by the apostles. Okay, there was pretty standard agreement up until this time. Think about it, just in our own context. If, let's say, George Bush, a past president of ours, if George Bush wrote a document or a book, it would be a bit easier and more easily accepted to know that it was really George Bush who wrote it, because we're closer to that time period in time, right, to George Bush. But if it was, let's say a new book that was circulating around claiming to be from George Washington, well, that might be a little bit more difficult to authenticate because that was longer ago in history. So maybe the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, it was much easier and just readily accepted that, yeah, these are the books that the apostles affirmed. But as you get further down in history, it becomes more questionable because you're farther removed from that time period. During the 4th century, as Christianity was legal now, that caused just a whole, people to come out of the woodwork, so to speak, with all of these fake books. So now that Christianity was legal, as you can imagine, now all these fake books really started to get pushed and circulated. So there were a lot of fake messages from God circulating around, hence the need for some of this in-depth research and agreement among Christians from various regions. There was also some of the books, when I say that most of the New Testament was generally accepted and agreed upon already, that was the case over the majority of the New Testament. But by the time you get to the 4th century here, there were a few of what we consider the New Testament nowadays, a few of the New Testament books that were really getting challenged. For example, Philemon, 3rd John, and the book of James. People were really starting to question whether those were in fact affirmed by the apostles or not. So, hence the need for these councils. That was the motivation, that was the driving purpose of these councils. So let's look at some of the research, some of the things that caused then the councils to conclude that in fact it was these particular 27 books that were affirmed by the apostles. Well, they made their decision, as I keep saying, based on good historical research and good historical evidence. Let me share some of that. They had very early evidence that these books were in fact affirmed by the apostles, and some of this evidence dated as far back as the first century, before 110 AD. So, for example, and this will be documented in some of those books that I sent around, but you can do this research on your own and see, the historical evidence that even convinces contemporary scholars of this. But even in the councils, they had access to this evidence. So, for example, they had evidence that before, so very early, as we've talked when you're doing historical research, to have the earlier the sources, the better. So, for example, before AD 110, 25 of the 27 books were being quoted as affirmed by the apostles. And they had access to that historical evidence. And that was part of what led them to conclude that, yes, these 27 books were affirmed by the apostles. Another example is kind of a lineage of teaching, right? So bear with me as we walk through this. So, for example, the Apostle John taught, discipled a man named Polycarp. Polycarp lived from 69 to 155. And then Polycarp, in turn, taught or discipled an author, a writer, a Christian named Irenaeus, who lived from 130 to 202. And we have a lot of writing from these two, both from Polycarp and Irenaeus, that has survived all these centuries. But together, just these two individuals, so we're talking one generation from the apostle and then second generation. So 2 generations from the apostles in that sort of disciple lineage, if you will. But together, those two, we have writings of them where they're quoting 23 of the 27 New Testament books, as being affirmed by the apostles. Irenaeus, in particular, affirms the authorship of all 4 of the Gospels. So it was that sort of historical evidence which led the councils to make their conclusions. Another piece of factoid history, if you will, we know from the historian Eusebius, who lived from 265 to 339. He was just a historian. But we know from him that Papias, who lived towards the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, we know that Papias, through Eusebius, the historian, we know that Papias confirmed the authorship of Matthew and Mark. Now, it would be very unlikely, this is another piece of, I think, good historical evidence that Mark really was the author of Mark, because that would be something that would be very unlikely for someone to lie about, right? If somebody is going to try to pass on their ideas or their message, their writing, their book as a message from God, everybody again understood this idea of apostolic authority. So if you wanted people to accept your book, you wouldn't have somebody, you wouldn't invent the idea of Mark writing your book. You would say it was written by Peter or Andrew or, one of the key apostles, not somebody like Mark. So it's very unlikely that would be made up or lied about, that Mark was the author of that particular gospel. If they were lying about it, why not say somebody famous like the Apostle Peter? As I keep saying tonight, the key is the apostolic affirmation. That might be a better term than apostolic authority. Apostolic affirmation. That is the key to know if a book is from God or not. That's more important than who wrote the book. So, let's say, worst case scenario, that the early Christians or even these councils made a mistake, for example. Let's say they made a mistake and Mark didn't really write the Gospel of Mark. Let's say instead Barnabas wrote it, and we should have been calling it the Gospel of Barnabas all these years. Would that be a huge ordeal if we've discovered that? I don't think so. I don't think that would matter all that much. Because what we have is good historical evidence that the apostles affirmed that what is written in the Gospel of Mark is really from God. In other words, an accurate recording of what Jesus and the apostles did, said, and taught. That's another reason why I don't think it should be troubling to us that we're not for sure who the author of Hebrews is. Sometimes that really rubs people the wrong way, that one of the 27 books in the New Testament, Hebrews, there's a lot of uncertainty as to who even wrote that book. But does it really matter? I would say no. It doesn't matter as much who wrote it. What matters most is, did the apostles affirm it was really from God or not? And we've got pretty solid historical evidence the apostles affirmed that Hebrews was in fact a message from God. So it's based on this sort of historical evidence that the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Hippo agreed that these 27 books were the ones that were affirmed by the apostles. Most of the New Testament books just passed the test with flying colors, right? Most of the 27 books, there was just so much historical evidence. It was obvious to all then and now that there's really no reason to even dispute whether they were affirmed by the apostles or not, because there's just so much good historical evidence. As I mentioned, there's Paul wrote 13 of the New Testament books, and there's 6, 7 of them that there's just so much historical evidence. Nobody disputes those. And the Gospels were very much agreed upon in these councils as well. There were some of the minor books that didn't have as much evidence as some of these others. So, for example, as we've discussed, Philemon, 3 John, and James are the classic examples. There's still good historical evidence that they were affirmed by the apostles, just not as much historical evidence as some of those other books that I mentioned. So still good historical evidence, just not as much. All right, I've got one more discussion question for you guys tonight. We're running out of time. We got about 10 minutes left. But before we close things up, I want you to discuss this. What sort of mistakes would really shake up our Christian beliefs? Mistakes by these early church councils, mistakes in their research, mistakes in their decisions. I mentioned one mistake that, let's say they made the mistake that Mark didn't really write the Gospel of Mark. It was Barnabas who wrote it. I don't think that mistake would cause much of a change in our Christian beliefs. But what are some mistakes that would maybe really rock our Christian beliefs? Are there any mistakes? What sort of mistakes, if they did make them, right, would really change how we should think and what we should believe about the New Testament and the Bible in general? So I'll let you discuss that for a few minutes here. Well, the last thing that I thought we could do tonight was to look at some of the books that these councils rejected and said, no, in fact, we don't think that there's good historical evidence they were affirmed by the apostles, or in fact, they had positive evidence that they were fakes. So let's look at some of these, and these are pretty well known. You might have even heard of some of these. So why did these councils, the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Hippo, reject some of these, as we call them now, fakes that were floating around? The Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, and we'll look at the Gospel of Judas real briefly tonight. Again, the reason they rejected them, bottom line, is that there wasn't solid evidence that they were affirmed by the apostles. So let's first take a look at the Gospel of Thomas. All right. There was a lot of excitement about the Gospel of Thomas in the mid-20th century because a complete version of it was discovered in 1945. This copy, which was discovered, was dated to the 4th century. And what the Gospel of Thomas is, it's not a narrative. All it is 114 supposed sayings of Jesus. Now, 2/3 of these sayings can be found in what we call the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So only 1/3 of these 114 sayings were actually unique to the Gospel of Thomas. These ones that were unique very clearly come from more of a Gnostic way of thinking. Just to be brief, Gnosticism was an alternative religion that developed in the 2nd century, and clearly these additional sayings were more Gnostic in their understanding of things. Now, some of the early Christian researchers, some of those early Christians who did this sort of research to try to understand which ones really were affirmed by the apostles, which ones were fake, knew about this fake gospel. So we have writings from Origen and Eusebius, for example, who were aware of this gospel, and they talked about it, and they said it was a forgery. But throughout history, it pretty much died off the scene, disappeared. It wasn't copied thousands and thousands of times like the New Testament books were. And so it was kind of lost in history, if you will, even though we had a record of people talking about it very early on. It was rediscovered then in the mid-20th century, and that's what got people all excited about it. But even modern scholars agree with the ancient scholars, Origen and Eusebius, that it was not written by the actual apostle named Thomas. All right, let's talk briefly, just have a few minutes left, about the Gospel of Peter. This again is something that the early Christians were aware of. We have writings from the early Christians who were aware of this fake, and they said it was a fake. So they would make lists, right? These early Christian researchers, early Christian leaders, they would make lists of these fake forgeries that were circulating around, and we still have some of those lists. So this has been seen in some of those lists from ancient Christianity, that they were aware of this and they were saying it was fake. It really wasn't from Peter. But again, it was one of those things that was lost in history. We were aware that it existed at one point, but we didn't have any copies of it for a long time. Because, again, since it was a fake and recognized as a fake, people weren't copying it and passing it on like the New Testament, like they did. That's why we have so many thousands of copies from the ancient world of the New Testament. We didn't have any copies of this until 1886. A copy was found in Egypt, and it was a copy from the 8th century. So copies were made of it, obviously, but just not nearly as many that was made of the 27 books of the New Testament. But once again, just like the ancient researchers, contemporary scholars agree that it was not, in fact, written by the actual Apostle Peter. The last one we can discuss real quick is the Gospel of Judas. We have, for example, in the historical record, an early Christian researcher, early Christian leader, Irenaeus, writing in AD 180, being aware of this forgery, discussing it, calling it a fake. But again, it was one of those things where it had been lost in history. We were aware of it, but we didn't have a copy of it. We didn't know what it actually said. But modern scholars agree that it wasn't written by the real Judas. But it's very, very clearly more of a Gnostic writing. It comes more from the Gnostic religion than early Christianity. The Gospel of Judas, what it purports to be, is secret teaching. This is just classic Gnosticism, this hidden knowledge or this secret teaching. So it's not Jesus's public sayings. It's not the things that Jesus said in public that could be verified by others, right? As we've talked about, just when people do historical research, it's great to have multiple independent sources. And that's what would come from public teaching, right? If somebody, like the Sermon on the Mount, he's teaching and hundreds, if not thousands of people heard it. And so it could be verified because it was public knowledge, because many people heard it. Well, the Gospel of Judas supposedly is information that Jesus did not say and teach in public, but was just shared privately with Judas. So it works out very well for conspiracy theories because this is secret, hidden knowledge that only Judas knew about, which, from a historical evidence standpoint, you already have red flags going up, right? Because it can't be authenticated if it's specifically this sort of hidden secret knowledge that only one person had. Supposedly it comes then, as I'm saying, from private conversations Jesus had with Judas. And according to this then, Judas wasn't the betrayer. He was really the only faithful disciple. He was the only one that Jesus shared this hidden truth with. And the 11 other disciples, in fact, corrupted Jesus' teaching. So what we have in the 27 books in the New Testament is actually that corrupted teaching from the other disciples, whereas this is the true teaching of Jesus as passed down from Judas, the only really good disciple. So it's clearly a case of a rival religion, Gnosticism, trying to push forth its own teachings. There's only one surviving copy that we have, the Gospel of Judas, compared to, as I've said, the thousands and thousands of copies that we have of the New Testament book. And this copy was discovered in the 20th century, but it was sold on the, I don't know if you'd call it the black market, but it was just sold and passed around to so many different interested parties that in that process of being sold for money, bought and sold over and over again, it kind of just has fallen apart. So there's really not hardly anything left of it. But this particular copy that was discovered had been dated to 3rd, 4th century. So that's just 3 examples of this, what's often called pseudepigrapha, these false books that were circulating around, and why the early Christians rejected it. Because again, there just wasn't good evidence they had been affirmed by the apostles. Now you hear of these from time to time, these fake gospels, because they make good conspiracy theories, right? If you've read the Da Vinci Code or Dan Brown's books that made them into Tom Hanks movies, right? The Da Vinci Code. They love to, that's an example of just a modern popular conspiracy theory where they take some of these false gospels and say, no, this really was the teaching of Jesus, but it's been suppressed by the church down through the centuries, and they're trying to protect male leadership, and so they've, disposed of all of these real teachings of Jesus. But it's so silly. I mean, if you love conspiracy theories, it might be entertaining to you, but it's pretty silly stuff. I mean, some of these fakes, just the idea of it protecting male leadership is hilarious, because some of these fake books teach that only men can go to heaven in the first place. So it's like they're not promoting any sort of ancient feminism or anything. It's just goofy conspiracy theories. All of this process just takes good historical research. As I said, though, if this is the type of apologetics that you're really drawn to or interested in, this might be a place where you want to study further. And that's what it takes. I mean, there are people, as I'm passing around the books, you can see that devote their entire lives to just this issue and studying the historical evidence. And there's a lot to look through. I'm certainly not an expert when it comes to it. But just think about it. I mean, think of the difficulty of doing some of this historical research and the work that has to go into it. I often think of, let's say nowadays, right, somebody wrote a fake book from George Washington, and then it was just kind of buried in the dirt or, lost in some library. And then 2,000 years later, people in the future discover this book. Well, it might be difficult for them to know if that book purporting to be from George Washington was really written by George Washington or not. It would take some historical research on their part. And that's similar, right, to what has to be done today, digging through the historical research, looking at the ancient research that was done, and then kind of following in their tracks, following in their footsteps, coming alongside and doing that research again, looking at their conclusions and trying to confirm them. But it is a pretty fascinating area of apologetics if you're interested.